Hey, welcome back. So in this one, we're going to learn all about one of, if not the single most important function in all of DAX, which is the calculate function. So if you've ever used the SUMIF function in Excel or any of its cousins like AverageIf or COUNTIF, you're familiar with the concept of a function that can perform a calculation conditionally. That is to say, some data points are included in the sum or average or count calculation and some are not. And even if you haven't used those functions, the concept is fairly straightforward. You have a calculation, like a sum, an average, or a count, that is performed contingent on some condition being true. So if we have a table with product sales with, say, 100 rows, we can use a function like that to sum or average product revenue, for example, for only certain specific products. In this way, we are performing that calculation conditionally. Now, the problem with those functions before is that you were limited to the somewhat very straightforward calculations that were baked right into the function's name. Sum if, average if, and so on. Well, now with calculate, we have access to a function that you can think of as a kind of anything if. A sum if on steroids, if you will. Calculate allows us to apply any of the measures in our data model, or any custom calculation that would qualify as a measure, conditionally, based on certain criteria that we specify. So the calculate function allows us to take the measures we've already defined, or new ones that we choose to define right in the calculate function, and then apply them conditionally. So now let's take a look at exactly how that works in a Power Pivot table, and then we'll move on to a useful example. So here we have a fairly straightforward pivot that just breaks out revenue by product name. Now our very first attempt at dipping our toe into the calculate water, so to speak, will be to create a measure that calculates our revenue measure, but contingent on our product name being beach umbrella. So let's go to our Power Pivot tab, and then create a new measure. And because this pertains to revenue, and the revenue measure is stored in our order details table, I'll assign this new measure to the order details table as well. And for now, I'll just call this umbrella revenue. And then for our formula, we'll start by typing out the calculate function. And now our expression, again, is either an existing measure or a new expression we define that could qualify as a measure. Now in our case, we're trying to apply a filter to our existing revenue measure, so we'll enter our revenue measure. And then the next argument will be the filter that we're trying to apply to that measure. That is to say, the logic that defines which records we're going to apply our measure to and which ones we're not. So for our purposes, our filter is products with the name beach umbrella. So after typing our comma, we'll search for the name field from our products table. And now our condition is going to be that this column equals the string beach umbrella. And because our criteria is a string, we'll need to put it in double quotes. And then we'll close our parenthesis and hit our check formula button. And it looks like we don't have any errors. And since our calculate function is just going to return a filtered version of our revenue measure, we'll format our new measure as currency, and then click OK. And now let's go ahead and add this new measure to our existing pivot table, right alongside our existing revenue measure. So over to our Pivot Table Analyze tab, I'll display our pivot table field list, and then roll down to our order details table, and then drag in our new umbrella revenue measure. Now, if this looks a little bit weird to you, you're not alone. Plenty of people are quite puzzled by the behavior of the calculate function the first time they see it in action. So if you look at the revenue amount for our beach umbrella product in our original revenue measure, that exact same number, $346,335, is being repeated for every single row of our pivot table in our umbrella revenue measure. So what's happening here? So the key thing to remember about calculate is that any filters that we specify in the function, in the measure definition, override any filters on the same field in our pivot table. So if you recall when we discussed the concept of a cell in a pivot table having coordinates or an address defined by where they sit relative to any row labels, column labels, or filters in the pivot, and how those row labels and column labels effectively apply filters to the numbers in our pivot table, our calculate function overrides those filters if there is a contradiction between the filter that we specified and the filter in the pivot table. So in this case, we applied a filter to the product name field. But our pivot table is also broken out by product name. So what happens? Our calculate filter charges in there and overrides the filter our pivot table is trying to apply. So in the very first row, our pivot table is saying filter the revenue measure by balsa board. But for our umbrella revenue measure, because we've already specified a filter on that exact same field, our specific filter, which says product name equals umbrella, overrides the filter being specified by the pivot table. And the result is we get the exact same number for every single row, that being the number resulting from our revenue measure being filtered for just the product beach umbrella. So one lesson to take away here is, if you have a measure that you've created with Calculate that filters on a specific field, it generally doesn't make a lot of sense to have that same field in the pivot table that you're putting the measure in. Because now you're going to have the situation of pivot table filters competing with and then being overridden by the filter that we specified in our Calculate function. So for example, if I swap in a different field on rows in this pivot table, like say for example region, now we get some more sensible results. So for our East South Central region, for example, that $31,297 revenue for umbrellas is actually a meaningful number. That is the amount of revenue we made strictly from beach umbrellas in the East South Central region. So our new measure is able to generate a meaningful number as long as we don't put it in competition with the same field we're filtering on by dragging that field into the row or columns area or even the filters area of our pivot. So now that we have the basics of Calculate down, let's move on to a slightly more interesting example. So let's say that we would like to track revenue by product for our customers who are Loyalty Club members versus all customers as a whole. So with the Calculate function's ability to filter a measure like revenue based on something like whether a customer is a Loyalty Club member, this should be pretty straightforward. So first, we'll go back to our Power Pivot window and create a new measure. And for the name, I'll go with LCM revenue for a Loyalty Club member. And then for our formula, we'll type calculate. And then just like before, our expression will just be our revenue measure. And then our filter is going to be that the Loyalty Club member field from our customers table equals 1. And because that 1 is a number and not a string, we don't have to put quotes around it like we did in the last example. So now I'll close that parenthesis, hit check formula, and because again this measure is just returning a filtered version of our revenue measure, we'll format as currency, and then click OK. And to make it a little bit easier to compare our Loyalty Club member revenue to our overall revenue, I'll go ahead and remove our umbrella revenue measure. And there we have it. A nice side-by-side comparison of overall revenue versus Loyalty Club member revenue. But because we've defined our LCM revenue as a measure, we can also use that measure in a calculation that creates yet another measure. For example, I can now easily crunch out the percentage of our overall revenue from just Loyalty Club member customers. So to do that, I'll create another measure, and I'll call it LCM revenue percent. And for this measure, I'm simply going to divide our LCM revenue by our overall revenue. So I'll use the divide function, and then just divide our LCM revenue by our overall revenue. And then for my alternate result, in case there is a division by zero error, I'll just enter the blank function. and then I'll close our parenthesis, check formula, and because our new measure is a percentage, we'll format as a number, and then as a percentage, and then click OK. And now we can see a breakout of what percentage of our overall revenue was driven by our loyalty club members by region. And because this measure did not involve any filters on the product field, I could just as easily swap products in on rows instead of region. And just to prove that, I'll remove our region name from the pivot and then swap in product. And as you can see, no issues. Now, one thing I would like to clarify before we go is that you're not limited to applying a single filter or criteria in your calculate functions. In fact, you can list as many as you want, giving you extremely fine-grained control over those measures. So let's say I want to see loyalty club member revenue for just our South Atlantic region, but broken out by product as we see here. Now this will involve applying filters to 2 different fields from 2 different tables. But because the filters I'm applying are both from tables that are related to the field that we're filtering via one-to-many relationships, and because they don't conflict with any of the filters in our pivot table, it should work just fine. So I'll create one more new measure, and I'll call it LCM Revenue South Atlantic. And then for our formula, first the calculate function, our revenue measure, we'll make sure our loyalty club member field is 1. But now if I type a comma, you see that we have the option to enter an additional filter. And again, you're not limited to just 2. You could keep adding more and more filters, as many as you need to get to the logic you want. And in our case, that will be region name equals South Atlantic. And now I'll close our parenthesis, check formula, format as currency, and hit OK. And now if I move that measure up 1 in our pivot table, just so we can see it side by side with our overall loyalty club member revenue, you'll see that the number is substantially less, about what we'd expect for revenue from one region versus all regions combined. So I hope at this point you have some appreciation for just how much control over your calculations the calculate function gives us. And while we've only explored using it in the context of a single measure, that being revenue, we could actually have used any of the measures that we've created thus far or defined our own right there in the calculate function. Okay, so in this video, we looked at how to filter measures by applying criteria to specific fields in our data model. Criteria that override the filters in our pivot tables. But in the next one, we're going to learn to do the exact opposite. We're going to learn how to do, in a sense, the opposite of filtering in our calculate function by removing any filters that are being applied in our pivot tables. I'll see you then.